May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. After my grandmother died and we were cleaning out her house, one of the more interesting things that I found was a huge pile of funeral cards. I hope you know what I mean by funeral cards. They're little pieces of paper about this big by this big, and they have a picture of the deceased on one side, and on the other side are the vital statistics, where and when they were born, where they died, sometimes a bit of inspirational or religious prose. And it turned out that my grandmother had saved every single funeral card from every single visitation she went to since she arrived in Canada. At the top of the pile were cards for people who, even if I had never heard of them, I could recognize. Pictures of old men and women, Italian immigrants, gray hair, tough features formed by decades of hard labor. They were the men and women of my grandparents' generation. By the time I knew them, they were the people I would see working in their gardens in the morning, congregating outside bakeries and hardware stores and in parks in the afternoon, and on their porches in early evening, resting in the twilight of their lives, decades of hard work and sacrifice having produced its reward. Those cards made up the bulk of the pile. But as I made my way through the cards, they started to change. The pictures first became more sepia-toned, then black and white. The fashions and hairstyles were different, and the people were recognizable, but still slightly different from the ones that I knew from my neighborhood and my grandparents' neighborhood. I remember one card in particular, towards the bottom of the pile. I haven't seen it in years. It's somewhere in my dad's basement, but I can't forget it. It was probably from the late 50s or very early 60s. I was struck by the fact that the deceased was about the same age I was at the time, in his late 20s, at most 30 or 31. He was from the same part of Italy as my family, and he lived on McRoberts Avenue, just around the corner from where my dad and grandparents lived in Toronto. I can't remember if he came from the same village as my family, or if we were even distantly related. It's possible, but I can't remember. What I do remember is the little bit of prose on the back. The first line is stuck in my head. I wish I could read it to you verbatim, but I can't. The people I come from can be very effusive, but I'm only half Italian, and I'm all Canadian, and becoming more so by the day. So I'll try to describe what was written. It was obviously written by the man's mother. It began like this: "Oh, Gigiuto." The O was stretched out with 6 H's, and was followed by 8 exclamation points. Then Gigiuto, the affectionate form of his name Luigi, was followed by 10 exclamation points. The sentences that followed all ended with these groups of multiple exclamation marks. In 30 or 40 words, a mother pouring out her grief at the loss of her son. I don't know anything specific about that man beyond what was written on that card. However, because he was one of tens of thousands of Italians who immigrated to Toronto at that time, I can be fairly confident in sketching out who he was. He had probably come over as a young adult before or with his parents. He probably worked in construction. He and his parents likely had the trajectory of their lives mapped out. He would work, look after his parents, get married and have children if he hadn't done so already. He'd maintain a house and eventually draw a pension, just as those gray-haired men I eventually knew did, having reestablished their family in a new land and seen their offspring to the second and third generation. Like the experience of any immigrant, it was all very human, a mix of selflessness and self-interest, nobility and basic needs, virtue and things less virtuous mixed together. However, in a moment for that family, all those plans came to nothing. The horizon became clouded and the abyss opened up. He may have been exploited by his employer. He may have been careless. One of his co-workers may have had too much beer at lunch. Maybe it was just a freak accident. Construction was a dangerous occupation then, even more so than now. Whatever happened, that little card is a reminder that even in the best and most stable life, there are moments when things seem out of balance, and regaining balance is outside of what any individual can control. If that funeral in mid-century Toronto was anything like what its funeral card suggests, I imagine it looked a lot like the funeral of Lazarus, as related to us in today's gospel from John. Lazarus is mentioned repeatedly in our story, but the man and who he is doesn't figure much into the narrative other than through his absence. Everyone is weeping. While he lays dying, his sisters send a message to Jesus begging for help. I don't know what they were expecting Jesus to do, but they were desperate to have some control over the situation. On hearing the news, Jesus sorrows over the pain that Lazarus' family is feeling. When he arrives in Bethany, everyone's in pain. Numerous people have come from near and far to join in the mourning, sharing in the pain of Lazarus' sisters and the hopes it might console them. Mary is at the grave of Lazarus, weeping with other mourners. Upon seeing the grave of Lazarus, Jesus wept. Why Lazarus engendered this kind of mourning is actually immaterial. The passage isn't just about Lazarus. It's a universal human situation, feelings that everyone knows. Loss is a part of life. It's been so since we emerged from the ooze and gained consciousness. No moral or technical progress, no amount of wealth or prosperity has eliminated loss and pain for anyone. They didn't have funeral cards in Jesus' time, but if they did, they would have at least one good piece of writing to put on them. I'm speaking of the psalm that's appointed for this morning, Psalm 130, an even more ancient text than our gospel. It's the lament of a person who finds themselves in a dark place, the depths. It speaks to more than just death. It speaks to every loss, every experience of helplessness, every pang of anxiety any human has ever felt. Remoteness from God, every distress, every persecution. Out of the deep have I called unto thee, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Even in the verses that are meant to be consoling, we can feel the pain of the psalmist. My soul looketh for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning, yea, more than watchmen for the morning. That image of being a lookout on the ramparts is one that contains in it a feeling of anxiety, the feeling that all is dark and threatening, being conscious of all that could assail and threaten you. As the night progresses further into darkness, it's harder to tell what's a real threat and what is your imagination playing tricks on you. If there's one thing to say about the people who wrote the Bible, the psalmists, the evangelists, the scribes, and the epistle writers, is that they were just as human as anyone and experienced the whole human condition and wrote about it. When they write about pain and loss, I can identify with it. It's universal. A critic of Christianity doesn't have to agree with or believe in the solutions they offer to the problem of being human. But I hope that they can at least read Psalm 130 or read about the anguish of Mary and Martha and see a truth about what it means to be human. When I talk of pain and loss as being a universal experience, something that every human knows, is that just a dour minister of religion trying to project his theology on a world that would otherwise be happy and a free, pain-free place? I don't think so. The mental health campaigns I see on TV tell me that the psalmist has captured something about being human. The tears of people I see coming out of the funeral home next door tell me that the psalmist has a point. So what do we say to the world? What does the church have to say to this world? If you've ever had to receive people at a visitation for a loved one, you know the kinds of things that people say. You also know the ratio of helpful and comforting to unhelpful and discomforting things people say, despite their best intentions. When my mother died, one of the more helpful things that was said to me by our longtime neighbor was this. She said, "I hope your faith has been a comfort to you." That statement is very general, but it was effective to me. And I don't know if Mrs. Sheffield watches this. I doubt she does. She's a churchgoer, and she has better things to do than to listen to sermons from a different city by someone she probably thinks of as a 16-year-old next door. But I just want to emphasize that it was very helpful to me. It didn't say any more than she wanted to say. It didn't get into deeper theological waters than either of us were prepared to go into, and it was meant to comfort me. And it got me thinking, which is the best part. My faith was a comfort as I found myself in the depths. It was exactly as I had been told it should be. But why was that? On what basis was it a comfort? Was it because my hope lay in the future? Was I comforted only by the promise of resurrection in the distant day? Or did the hope of what I believe in and what the church teaches me to believe in allow me to hope for more? In the gospel, Lazarus is raised from the dead by Jesus. But if the pain of his family's experience is representative of a pain that is part and parcel of human existence, then we can also say that his being raised to life says something about our future and God's promise to all humanity. This would seem to be a promise of the resurrection of the dead, which it is, but it's more than that. When the earliest Christians tried to get their heads around what had happened to the world because Jesus had come, they discerned that the decisive event was that God had raised him from the dead. If it was God's will that death should be conquered by Christ, then death would be conquered for all who believe in him. As the portion of the letter to the Romans that we read this morning says, if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also through his Spirit that dwells in you. But they also came to know that there was more to it than that. From the days of the psalmist and before, the ugly face of death stalked humans in lots of small ways. The death of a loved one like Lazarus, depression, oppression, darkness. If Christ had conquered death and promised the resurrection of the dead, then the resurrection must have power to right those things that seem askew and make harmonious those parts of our lives which are disharmonious. As the epistle to the Romans also says, to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. If Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. The resurrection is not just something that we wait for in the future, but rather we are incorporated into the resurrection beginning in this life. The resurrection begins in this life, just as it did for Lazarus, for whom death was defeated for a time. A promise of the permanent defeat of death for all which was to come. The promise of the resurrection in our lives is that the places and things of darkness will be totally defeated. God is the enemy of death, of darkness, of depression and destruction. When the Spirit is at work carrying God's power of resurrection, Christians believe that it is not merely helping us coexist with darkness, but it's the first sign of humanity being pulled out of the deep into the light. The Christians whose experience of resurrection shaped both the letter to the Romans and the Gospel of John believed this to be the case because they saw it at work in them, in their own lives, just as those of us who have received that faith can continue to see. Some of these things are seen and comprehensible. The way that life in the Spirit causes people to work to push back against the darkness and claim space in the world for the reign of Christ. These are the places where pain and sorrow are met with kindness and understanding. Hunger and cold is met with food and shelter. Injustice is met with justice. There are also things that are seen but not comprehended. The spiritual peace that comes from a mind focused on God and God's promises in prayer and meditation, the comfort of common worship, the grace received in the sacraments. Pain and loss are part of the human condition. They're a big part of life, but they're not God's will for what it means to be human. I know this by experience, and I've tried to illustrate it as much as possible, but I'm afraid in the end, the ultimate evidence is that of faith. I know I have been lifted out of isolation and loneliness and deep mourning repeatedly by the power of resurrection through life in the Spirit. I can point to specific examples in my life, and if you end up hearing me preach enough times, you're probably going to hear about most of them. When Jesus wept over the grave of Lazarus, he wept not only because of the sorrow of the situation, because he knew that to free Lazarus and all humans from the grave, he himself would have to enter into it. And he would, and he did. I know that's the case because I've seen it at work every Good Friday and Easter of my life. And my faith is that I'll see it at work in 2 weeks' time when we journey through Good Friday and Easter together. My faith is that I will see it at work again when it is time once again for me to cry out from the deep. And I have faith that I will ultimately see that power at work when I emerge from the darkest of caves and the bindings loosen from my arms and legs and the arms and legs of those who I've known and loved, and also those like Luigi from McRoberts Avenue, I have not known. And together we hear the voice finally say, fully, finally, and definitively, unbind him and let him go. Thanks be to God. Amen.